here is I was invited here because there was some bones found on the cave floor surface of the Guhoi cave just near here. Hike or walk or somewhere that you're out in the wilderness and you find something that looks old, something that looks interesting, that doesn't look like modern garbage, which will be archaeology in the future, but it's not archaeology now. The most important thing to do is, if it's in a safe location, is to just take note of where the location is. You can describe it and then contact us at the Archaeological Studies program. The reason for this is because as archaeologists, we care about the object that you find, but what we care more about is how it was laying in the ground. We care about its context, is what we call it, archaeological context. So really what we care about is where the object was found, what was found with it, what was it laying around, what layer was it found in, what kind of soil was it found in, what kind of plants were around it. All of these things can help us identify what happened to it after it was disposed of or lost. It can help us date artifacts, and it gives us a clue of how it was used or what its purpose was. So all of that information is far more valuable to an archaeologist than the actual find, right? And a lot of times, especially back before archaeology was a field that archaeology only started really as a formal field in the turn of the 20th century. So before that, there wasn't very many standard methods that people use, and so a lot of people would just collect things and then have them in a museum or in their house, and it's very pretty, but we've lost all the information about what was important about it in the past. So you can think of it as, if you have a book and you take a rip out of the book and you have a picture of that on the page, that picture is very nice, but without the rest of the book and the rest of the page, we don't know what that picture means or what all the information that's associated with it. So just to give you an example of this, this is much more of a North American image than one for the Philippines. But for example, if we were to find a stone tool here, we would be able to look at all the information of the layers, what was below it, what was above it, what else was in that layer. That would help us date it. It would help us determine who was using it, and it would give us an idea of how important it was. So, if you can't leave it, if you're afraid that it's going to either get lost again or damaged or stolen, and so you feel like it needs to be moved to be protected, then please take a ton of pictures of the surrounding area, of the artifact before you touch it, everything around it, any information that you think could be important, take pictures. There's no such thing as too many pictures. And take notes, describe what you see, describe where it's laying, how it's laying, what your ideas is, if you see things that are close by to it, if you feel like those are associated with it or not. Just take all the information that you can before you move it. Okay, now moving into osteoarchaeology. So this is my specialty, is I look at the human skeleton, and I specialize in the human skeleton found in archaeological situations. What we can learn about the human skeleton is actually quite a bit. So depending on what we have preserved, how many of the bones we have preserved, how good of a preservation it is, we can generally identify the sex of the individual, their age, if they suffered from health conditions throughout their life, say in childhood or even as adults, if they had trauma from either violence or accidents. We can even tell their diet sometimes using chemical analyses, and sometimes we can get DNA from them. We can also tell from the context that they're situated in a lot about the cultural practices, the mortuary practices, how the dead were treated, and whether that individual was treated in the way that we would expect for that culture or not. And if they're not treated in the way that we would expect, so if they're not buried in the cemetery grounds, but they're buried outside the cemetery grounds, or if there is a mass burial in an area that you would expect single burials, that could tell us something really important. Either the person outside the burial grounds was somehow shunned from their society. If it's a mass grave where we wouldn't expect it, say in England, there's a lot of mass graves, even though they would prefer Christian burials. But during the plague, people were dying so quickly that they didn't have time to bury them individually, and so all those people are now in mass graves. So even just the context of how the people were buried gives us a lot of information of how they died and how they were treated. An important thing, if you do think you find human bones when you're out on a walk, is the important thing to remember is that they may not be archaeological, they may actually be forensics, right? So it may be linked to someone's death in modern life. The key thing is that if the person died 50 to 75 years ago or older, then it's archaeology. If they died within the last 50, 75 years, then it's forensics. The reason why we have that cutoff is that we think if someone died in the last 50 to 75 years, then there's still people alive who care about them and who remember them and know them. And if they were murdered or hurt, the person who did that could still be alive as well, and they could still be brought to be punished. If it's older than that, then that person might not be remembered by the community, and there might not be that emotional bond, so then it moves into the realm of archaeology. But obviously, we change this with each situation. So it all depends on how people feel about the death of the person, whether we treat it as archaeology or forensics. I was invited here because there was some bones found on the cave floor surface of the Guhoy cave just near here. This cave was said to be one of the hideouts for Francisco de Guhoy and his soldiers during what was the longest revolt in the Philippines history, and I believe the only one that actually won. So very important historically for Danao, for Bohol, for the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and even humanity that the rebels won against a colonial power. And so it was suggested that perhaps we should look at these bones because it might actually be the bones of Francisco and his soldiers. I'm a bit pessimistic by nature, so I always said, oh, we'll take a look, but I'm not sure. And I'm glad that I came because it's been really exciting. So I'm sure that you guys all know this, but in this area, there's 30 caves. And the cave that we're looking at right now, we're talking about is the Guhoy cave right here. You can get to it from here, but it's not an easy walk. You have to be careful. I hurt my leg going into one of the caves yesterday. So I have a souvenir from my trip. This is the mouth of the cave here, where you could see that they would have lived. So it's not easy to get to. Even before the earthquake, it wouldn't have been easy to get to. It would not have been somewhere that people would just stop on a hike to rest. It'd be somewhere that you would aim to go to, and you'd work hard to get up there, right? So you had to really want to be hidden in that cave. This is a picture of the bones that I was brought to analyze. So 3 boxes of fragmented bones. This is normal in archaeology. Very rarely do we get nice, beautiful skeletons all in one piece. Normally we get fragments. So a big part of learning human osteoarchaeology is not only learning the skeleton, but learning how to identify a small piece of a bone and be able to say that's a right elbow. So we know how to look at fragments. It takes years, but you start to learn how to recognize human bone fragments and what part of the body they're from. So when I got here yesterday, I looked at just the top layer of bones. My aim for this trip was to see if there are human bones, and if there were, then to start planning how we're going to deal with that. And within less than 2 minutes of being there, I was calling everybody over because already on the first layer, I had found human bones. So I haven't even dug into the boxes yet. So right away, there was already evidence of humans. There's also animals mixed up in there. and I'll talk more about what that can tell us too about the how they lived in the cave and about the environment. So what I found are pieces of human cranium. So these are fragments from the skull. This fragment here is from the back of the head. So that's very clearly human. We have a very unique back of our head compared to other animals. So that was actually one of the first piece that I saw, and I said, that is definitely human, there's no argument. We also have a bit of the inside of the ear of an individual. This could be important later if we get money and funding and the project gets as big as we hope it could get, because inside the ear is so secure and enclosed by bone that's a really great place to get DNA preservation. So we've already bagged it and we make sure that no other human touches it because we don't want too much contamination. My DNA is already on it now. We want to lessen the human DNA on it, but potentially that could be a very important find. We also found bits of human jaws, and we know that it's at least from at least 2 people here, the jaws. We have a chin, so we can see. Humans are also the only animals to have a chin. Even Neanderthals, our ancestors, apes, our closest relatives, they don't have chins. Modern humans are the only animals to have a chin. We don't know why. But you can bring that up at cocktail parties as a good fact to have. We also found 2 teeth so far. Teeth can be important because they can also hold DNA and chemical analyses that we can do to analyze the remains. And we found 3 pieces. Keep in mind that this is only the top layer of the boxes. 3 pieces of a human right elbow. So what that tells me right away, just looking at the top layer, is that we have a minimum number of 3 individuals so far. So it's not 1 human, we have at least 3 humans, because it's impossible for humans to have more than 1 right elbow at a time, right? So right away we know, just even in the top layer, we have evidence for 3 individuals. A really exciting find is this is a piece of human cranium. It is about right here, the side of your head. And what's interesting about this is it shows evidence of burning. So this bone has actually been burnt. It's turned white and cracked. And on this end, you can see this is the normal bone color, but this is dark gray and black and white, telling me that it has been heated and around fire. So when I saw this, I was thinking, why would a human bone be burnt, right? So generally when we find burnt bones in the archaeological record, it could be a natural fire. An animal died in a forest fire. Could be cooking. Humans cook with fire. And then talking to the locals and hearing stories, what we actually found was that how the story goes is that the way that at the end of the revolt, the Spanish actually started to bomb the cave. And that there are stories of a fire being at the cave. So I have to do further analyses on this, but this could be evidence of either someone that died in the fire, in the bombing, or perhaps died before that and their body was burnt in that fire and bombing. We don't know, this is all speculation so far. I haven't done any science on it yet. This is just trying to think of why human remains would be burnt in that situation. When I get back to the lab and I think more about it and look at my pictures, what I'm going to try and do is try and identify exactly what temperature the bone was exposed to. So we can tell by the changes of the color and the way that the change of the properties of the bone has gone through with the fire. We can tell how long it was been exposed to and at what temperature. Also, what I'm hoping to tell is whether they were fleshed or not, right? So if a body was fleshed when it caught on fire, it's going to take a lot longer before the bone starts to get burned because it has to burn away all the flesh first. If it was a skeleton already caught on fire, then it's just the bone's going to burn first. So that's going to be important information to tell me whether the person might have died in the fire or before. But if you remember, if you remember from that picture, there was white on the outside and on the inside was dark. So that makes sense in that white bone you get at a higher temperature, and the dark bone you get at a lower temperature. The white part of that bone was on the outside of the skull, and the dark part was on the inside. So that tells us that the outside of the skull was probably intact. The outside was getting more of the heat, longer exposure of the hotter heat, and the inside got less heat before the fire was put out. So considering that a natural fire, like a forest fire, can reach 900 degrees Celsius when you're in the flames, you're not being held over the flames, you're in the flames. And this person seems to have been burnt at about 400 to 600 degrees. So that makes sense if you especially think if there was flesh and the flesh had to be burnt away first. So it could be that the person was either not directly in the middle of the fire, but outside of the fire and still being burnt in that 600 degree temperature. Again, this is all speculation. I need to do more reading and more comparisons. I need to look at other bones that have been burnt, and that's how we do it, is we compare. We do experiments. If this is burnt, what does it look like? And then compare to see what looks the closest to the bone that we found. But yeah, so this is showing the comparison for the pictures. And we can even see evidence of boning. This is the inside between the bones. So if the bone is broken, you're looking at the inside of the bone here. And we have evidence of burning there as well. So that shows that the fire has actually gone, the heat has gone through the bone. So it's not just on the surface either. So the main question is, can we determine a date for the bones, right? So humans have been on Bohol for a long time. It may not be bones from this era. And the question is, the answer is maybe. That I don't know yet. We have to work with that. If the bones had been found in a layer, we could date the layer, but they weren't. They're found on the surface of the ground, so that makes it harder to date. One option is carbon-14 dating. So carbon-14 is an isotope that's in the air. Plants metabolize the carbon-14. Animals eat plants that have the carbon-14. We eat plants and animals. So we have the same carbon-14 as the air, as the plants, as the animals that we eat. So it stays the same. What's interesting about carbon-14 isotope compared to the other carbon isotopes is that it's radioactive. And what radioactivity means is that the isotope breaks down and it decays over time. That's radioactivity. If an isotope is stable, it's not radioactive, it doesn't emit any energy, but carbon-14 breaks down. And what's really interesting about it is that it breaks down in a systematic way. So it follows the same pattern, and we know what that pattern is. So if we look at carbon-14 in a bone, and we can see how much it's decayed, we can take that and compare it to a non-decayed carbon-14, and we can say it's been this many years that life form has been dead, because that's how long it's taken for the carbon-14 to decay that way. So this is an example. So if these are age of years, so something that's 25,000 years old would have a very small amount of carbon-14 left. If these bones are from the Daguhoy Revolution, they're going to be right up at the top of where we can date with carbon-14. So carbon-14 can only really be used with finds that are older than 100 years old. Otherwise, it's too new. The carbon-14 is not going to decay. So if it is the Daguhoy Revolution, we might be able to get a carbon-14 date. So that would be the best case of how we can date the remains. That being said, carbon-14 dating does cost money, so we'll have to find funding and sponsorship, and hopefully we can, because this is going to be the best way that we can date the bones, I think. So going back to the actual bones, in amongst the human bones are animal bones. So one of the reasons why I came here, even though pessimistically I thought there might not be human bones, is that animal bones are just as interesting to archaeologists. Animals tell us about the environment, Also, humans eat animals, we use animals, and we live with animals. So animal remains can tell us a lot about humans as well. And if you remember where the cave is, the size of the animal bones, even just looking at the picture, told me that these were medium-sized animals. These weren't small birds or lizards. They weren't cows or elephants. They were deer, pig, goat, local animals that would be medium-sized. They're not going up into that cave by themselves to die, right? So we have a big pile of animal bones. Deer don't naturally walk up a cave and go and lay down on top of another dead deer to die. So that tells me right away that humans were bringing animals into the cave. So even if there weren't human bones there, we have evidence that humans were living in the cave. So I was pessimistic about finding human bones, but I was optimistic about finding some information about how the cave was used. Interesting also is these are two animal bones, and they also show evidence of burning. What's interesting though is that this burning pattern is a little bit different. See, this one is just a line of dark, and this one is another line of dark. So it's not entirely burnt like the human bone, and it's not as dark or as white or cracked. So it was burnt at a lower temperature. And so I think it was probably cooked, which would make sense. Humans like to cook their meat. But again, I have to do those analyses. But that could give us evidence supporting the notion that people were living in that cave. Also, I haven't done this analysis yet, but when I get to looking at the bones in a lot more detail, hopefully what we can find is evidence of butchery on the bones, so evidence of how and where they were being cut up. Again, just supporting the idea that they were cooking the animals, that they were living in the cave. How many animals were there, how many were cooked, and what type of species were there could give us an idea of whether they were hunting, whether they were being given domestic animals or stealing domestic animals, maybe how many people they had to feed over a certain amount of time for how many animals were there. So we're hoping that even just the animal bones themselves can give us a lot of information. We also found a bit of ceramic. I'm not sure what role this plays yet, but if I am not a ceramic expert at all, it doesn't interest me. If it wasn't living once, I'm not really interested in it. But my colleagues in Archaeological Studies program, they are experts in this, so I'm going to get them to tell me when they think this was made. This might be our best way of giving a relative date, because if ceramics are made in certain properties, paint, types of paint is made, fashion, right? If you can think about what's in style now from in the past, those change in time. So ceramics can be a good way of dating too. So if we can say that the ceramic was from the time, was something that was used around the time of the Diliman Revolution, and this was found in with the bones, that would help us support that dating. Again, just preliminary, we don't know yet. So the big question that you guys all want to know is, are these the remains of people that were involved in the rebellion? And the answer is I don't know. Unfortunately, the remains that I've found so far are not diagnostic of anything. I can't say much except for that they're human right now. I'm hoping to find more information if we find more bones. With the size of the fragments, we probably won't be able to sex them or age them. But if you think about the cave location again and how difficult it is to get to, it's not somewhere that people are going to have used for living in a cave for a reason other than hiding out from.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim. So the next part of our program will be the open forum. So that time you may ask questions relevant to the presentation of Dr. Plomp. So you see,
So these are the animal bones. And if you look at animal bones versus human bones, this is a human bone here.
So this is a very relevant and very
Animal bones are quite a bit denser than human bones. They have a different feel. They feel more soapy. Human bones are more porous, and they're not as thick. So if you can look at the difference in the thickness.
So this is human bone.
This is animal. This is yeah. So animal bone is a lot more like thick chalk, and human bone is more porous and light. So it can be quite difficult even for someone trained in certain pieces to identify human or animal. So if you're not sure, phone the police first and they'll come. And we quite often go and say, no, that's an animal. It's actually really interesting in Canada. The hand of a bear looks very similar to a human hand. So if you don't have the claws, we often get called out because people think they found a human hand. And it does look human.
Which one is
No, we don't.
animal? This is animal.
Animal
Oh.
and human.
What part?
This is elbow. And this I don't know animal though. I think leg. And then this is the burnt human bone here. So you can see how different the outside is. So all that cracking is from the fire.
This is also human bone.
This is animal bone that's been cooked.
Ribs. Human, di ba? Ano mga kahawak mo?
Labas mo nga yung isa.
Ay, don't touch na.
I have 4 cats.
Less is less contamination.
That is the inside of the ear.
Oh, that's good.
So that hole there is actually part of your ear canal.
Good, so they can
So this is why my course is very hard, is because students have to tell me what that is
Yeah.
and tell me what side it's from. So that would be on a test, and that would be considered easy after. So
So that's
that's a hard course.
right
yes.
or left?
I'm not taking that test. That one is right.
Right.